Welcome to a reading of my book, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 3, Preface to an Error Theory of Consciousness. Oversight or deficit can be revelatory when growing awareness turns these perceptual gaps into conspicuous absences. Such are evident not just in the neglect of subjectivity in materialism, objectivism and religion, but also in historical and prehistoric perspectives where a clear concept of mind is often absent or obscure. Linguistic indications could be found, for example, in the Hebrew term nephesh and the Greek psyche, which both use body language in the form of the breath of life to express the idea of spirit. These are incipient developments in the idea of consciousness that can provide us with some fine examples of both the revelation and obfuscation of mind, as well as their explanation in error theory. As part of this process, religious projection is a paradigm example of how consciousness can be drawn to our attention through an absence of its explicit recognition. At a more obvious level, the changing focus of philosophy has also moved historically from objective to subjective perspectives through metaphysics, epistemology, phenomenology, and even to philosophy as psychology. But comprehensive accounts of subjective mental states such as will, value, ethical satisfaction, meaning, personal identity and consciousness itself are still not widely available. Such shortcomings should by themselves be sufficient to question how these issues can be handled and to raise doubts about contemporary philosophy itself. We can also, without labouring the point, reiterate earlier noted unresolved questions about the character of mind, free will and personal identity. To these we can add questions about cognition, thought, feeling and phenomenal experience, moral intent and the good will, as well as how mental states connect with actions, events and objects in the world, and even the problem of demonstrably proving the existence of other minds. Developments in neurology, psychology, sociology and history, as well as linguistics, ethics and philosophy of mind, are throwing new light onto these issues all the time, but they remain unresolved. It's not just that further research is needed along previously established lines of inquiry, but that we lack both fundamental insight and a deep appreciation of the character of mind. We also don't appreciate our failure to recognize the nature of the problems and the inadequacy of the questions. I will argue here that a structural conception of mind, self-evident or controversial, will shift our philosophical focus and even illuminate key questions. A gradualist perspective can, as noted for example, help to explain the obscurity of consciousness as an aspect of regression, as well as other issues such as those involving degrees of will, free will and belief. A gradualist view of mind both explains and is implied by the emergence of evolution and development of consciousness in animals, human life, individual history and personal growth. This view is indebted to Darwinian thought as much as developmental psychology. It is surprising or unsurprising to find that Darwin wrote that in the distant future psychology will be based on a new foundation, but the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by graduation. Mental graduation is a natural and psychological development which has philosophical significance. Consciousness cannot be properly understood outside a spectrum which can bring together human, animal and other levels of mind. On such a gradualist view, animal consciousness is initially aware of the external world, becomes sentient, but is not aware of its own existence. In later stages, the development of human consciousness expresses an increasing independence and detachment from the physical structures out of which it emerged in the form of an awareness of one's own awareness, personal identity, sensitivity towards other conscious beings, and more contentiously, emancipation and independence of values from external factors. The possibility of regression back into pre-reflective consciousness is the stuff of error theory. In the animal world, observations of mental faculties in the celebrated Rouge test or the monkey in the mirror experiments also reveal a significant correspondence between levels of consciousness, particular mental capacities, and different degrees of biological and neurological development. When red marks are put on the faces of different animals in the view of mirrors, dogs simply bark, but chimpanzees, and as more recently found, also dolphins and elephants, have different reactions. The response of most chimpanzees over 6 years old is initially quizzical. They then seem to go through a kind of chimpanzee enlightenment, where they recognize the image of themselves and respond accordingly by wiping off the red mark or by using the mirror image to preen themselves. Dolphins and elephants make similar responses, but dogs continue to bark at reflected images of themselves that they perceive to be other dogs. Yet as chimpanzees can recognize themselves in mirrors, this indicates that they are able to form conceptions of themselves, and because they are able to form such conceptions, they can be said to have a more sophisticated cognitive faculty than dogs. In fact, a chimpanzee's self-awareness seems to qualify as a form of self-consciousness previously only attributed to humans. Elephants seem to have a capacity for mourning over the loss of the remains of the brethren. Yet in either chimpanzees or human infants, as would be expected of a graduated mind with different levels of development, there is little evidence of abstract thought, such as the apprehension of the world through general principles rather than concrete particulars. These experiments and observations are significant in several ways. Firstly, against widely held belief, they provide a way of empirically demonstrating the existence of self-consciousness. They further reveal different levels of mind and mental capacity. They show that these broadly correlate with levels of biological complexity, and they also exhibit borderline levels of consciousness where an ambiguous state between self-awareness and an absence of that capacity can be observed. An example of occluded and borderline human consciousness in religious and historical development has been provided by Julian Jaynes' unlikely but interesting claim, to be revisited in chapter 3, that as recently as 3 millennia ago, people were not conscious as we are. That is, they lacked awareness of their own motivations and instead thought and acted through the externally hallucinated medium of the gods, which replaced an absent conception of themselves. The significance of this account doesn't lie in its plausibility or even its lack thereof, but in its deployment of gods, social constructs, linguistic periphrases and bodily references as alternative means of perceiving and expressing conscious experiences which could not otherwise be articulated in the absence of an explicit conception and realization of the individual's own existence. There is no need to agree with James that this vicarious deployment of gods involved no consciousness whatever, or that in this era people were not self-conscious or had no mind, will or soul of their own, in order to accept that his argument would more readily support some kind of perceptual error theory and self-occlusion comparable to that proposed here. A more moderate and credible account of socio-linguistic development can be found, however, in Nicholas Humphrey's explanation of the linguistic novelty of the concept of consciousness, and hence also of self-consciousness. Language is an indicator of both familiarity and unfamiliarity with objects, because awareness of an object will generate a corresponding vocabulary. Humphrey duly informs us that in Latin the verb conscire, the origin of conscious, literally meant to share knowledge with other people. In the Middle Ages, the meaning of having private conscious knowledge of one's own thoughts was differentiated from one's moral conscience. In the 17th century, consciousness was used to describe all mental activity, and only more recently as a state of existence. Thomas Natsoulis concurs that the word consciousness first appeared in print in 1681, and that the word conscious still earlier, in 1601, when Ben Jonson was already ridiculing its poetic use to describe inanimate objects. Such accounts reveal both an early neglect and the historical development of the notion of consciousness, which indicates both the development of the phenomenon of consciousness as well as an inherent tendency towards self-obfuscation. The statement of personal consciousness in the word I is also tellingly omitted by some cultures and customs, as well as because of prohibitions of ego. It was given attention by George Herbert Mead in showing how children learn to use the concepts of I and me, usually after the age of 2, with the development of a more distinct personal identity. This omission is amusingly reflected in modern folklore in Star Trek's android Data, who also had difficulty in using the word I. Later developmental psychology, such as that of Jean Piaget, offers a further account of graduation in mental faculties and self-awareness consistent with Mead, with our claims here, and with Freud's considerations of ego development from infancy to adulthood, that also involves an increasing individuation, differentiation, and alienation of the self from the world. Piaget distinguished 4 stages of child development based on abilities to think about oneself and to make sense of the world. In the first stage, from birth to 2 years old, the child learns by touching objects and by exploring the physical environment. At the second stage, between 2 and 7 years old, children master language and learn how to use symbols and gestures. Piaget regards children at this stage as egocentric, in the sense of not being able to see things from other people's points of view. At stage 3, between 7 to 11, children master abstract and logical notions, but still have problems appreciating different points of view. Piaget's final stage comprises of the adolescent years from 11 to 15. The child is then able to grasp highly abstract and hypothetical ideas, a level that Piaget claims is not reached by many adults who remain largely egocentric in their perspectives. Some criticisms of Piaget have been that his work lacked experimental controls, overlooked cultural effects, and that a child's development is more complex and variable than his models suggest. With respect to its uncertain application as a theory of mental graduation, Faculties may be just particular or learnt skills that do not represent different levels of consciousness, illustrated in the skills systems distinction in robotics and artificial intelligence. But the general thrust of Piaget's work is widely accepted, and the objection that various faculties could not represent different levels of consciousness will be made on a presupposition that rejects the possibility of a graduated account of mind that I begin to argue for in the following chapter. Given the possibility of graduated consciousness, it would follow that it would involve the expression of different faculties. Exceptions to a rigid reading of Piaget's or other models of graduation, however, are to be expected and need not impugn the central development principle, which is difficult to apply directly to particular instances within the complexities of life, as well as because of the variable and overlapping character of mental states. With respect to both egoism and the attraction of physical objects, these could be expected by reason of initial development through interaction with the world in a process of self-discovery which must precede an awareness of other self-conscious individuals. That is, the discovery of the physical world precedes self-discovery, and following both Mead and Piaget, the recognition of other self-conscious individuals as self-conscious must involve reference to oneself in order to acquire the categories of thought and experience needed to recognize others as having self-consciousness, and vice versa in a mutually complementary process. Other faculties and tendencies of the mind can also be noted, such as attachments to cognitive representations of the world. Such tendencies have been recorded in Hume's views on the mind's inclination to spread itself over external objects, John Mackey's employment of them, and in Freud's analytic characterization, wherein mind tends to lean upon objects and finds difficulty withdrawing from them. The latter is particularly relevant to the issue of dependency, value attachment, and independence that inform the notion of sufficiency or dependence of value central to this inquiry. It is significant that Mackey's argument is against the idea of objective values, which might, in support of a preference for sufficiency, be used as an illegitimate form of mental support. Much later I will compare this view to the existentialist renunciation of objective values, to which can be added Bernard Williams' employment of the notion of self-indulgence. Part of Mackey's argument involves the tendency of mind and values to spread itself over external objects with which it is confused. This syndrome helps to explain the attraction of the external world, as well as the error of self-consciousness of confusing a conception of one's self-consciousness with one's diminished awareness of it. Not to recognize the difference is to be in the grip of the error. These related elements of the opacity of mind, error theory, a gradualist concept of mind, and personal and evolutionary development find support in accounts of personal experience as well as in empirical observations and psychological theory. In addition to our observations of other people and other creatures, we have evidence from our own experiences of changes that take place in both the capacity of our own mental faculties and general levels of awareness. Different levels of consciousness, for instance, obtain at different life stages. I assume that, like others, I was once a fetus with minimal consciousness. I can remember direct observations of changes from my early infancy through to my childhood and my adulthood. The experience of being conscious of myself as an adult is richer and fuller than I had as an infant or a child, and particular capacities and faculties of perception and sensitivity have also increased. It is largely novelty and hindsight that give childhood perceptions their distinctiveness, and the misty awareness of my infancy has cleared into the haze of adulthood, and as an adult my levels of consciousness continue to be affected by thought, sleep, drugs and other circumstances. Despite the doubts of a few philosophers like Colin McGinn and the implications of Sartre's ultra-phenomenological perspective, as Dominic Lacapra calls it, which disregards semi-conscious states, consciousness can occupy a wider spectrum than that of the average wakeful human. It can range from a pre-conscious recognition of the external world found in simple vertebrates to the pre-reflective consciousness of nearly all non-human animals, to unconscious and human sleep states, to pre-conscious processing, to normal reflective human self-consciousness, and to perhaps hyperconscious states and peak experience described by psychologists such as Oliver Sacks, Abraham Maslow and Ken Wilber's theologically eccentric work, The Spectrum of Consciousness. The spectrum or graduation that I advance here, however, involves different levels of consciousness across a whole range of animal life, of which humanity is a part, and which individuals exhibit different capacities of self-awareness, which again need not be constant in any one individual. Across the wider spectrum, we can reiterate that pre-reflective animal consciousness is aware of the external world, which by definition is not aware of its own existence. Its awareness is directed at external objects rather than itself, and its conscious identity is sustained by biological and external factors rather than by processes of cognition and reflection. In addition to immersion, singular reference and regression, the latter can be tracked in an emergence from, as well as a close relation to, the above, not to mention other factors such as the presence of the unconscious mind and cultural and conceptual influences that render human consciousness susceptible to self-obfuscation and opacity. These zoological, historical, empirical, linguistic, psychological, philosophical and personal considerations, together with a corroborating gradualist conception of mind, provide grounds for an error theory in explaining the opacity of consciousness. In the language of metaphor, the mind's own closeness or familiarity with itself prevents the wood from being seen for the trees, or in the words of another mistaken figure of speech, the eye cannot see itself. Even though these metaphors ignore the mirrors of reflection and conceptual analysis, they express a known problem that requires attention. The risk of regression is due to the formative structures from our primordial past, the character of our consciousness, our unconscious, and its relation with the world. Reflective human self-consciousness is thereby susceptible to drifting back into prior patterns of awareness and self-obfuscation. As a natural tendency, this error or deficit of awareness might be expected to present itself on occasions of sloth, stress, or exhaustion, as well as in the usual course of things. Yet a paradigm example of error theory is found in religious belief, exemplified by Feuerbach's projection theory, showing how mind can routinely apprehend itself in terms of objects other than itself. The fundamental error and insight expressed in religion is to understand consciousness in terms of other than itself. People have minds, and almost everyone is conscious, yet the idea of consciousness is one of the least understood in the history of human thought. and the above outline of regression provides one of the reasons why. The second explanation of this neglect and self-obfuscation, in which consciousness tends to understand itself vicariously through external objects, is again that self-consciousness is prone to overlook that dimension of consciousness in which it is immersed, illustrated earlier with the analogy of fish in water. And thirdly, self-obfuscation is also produced by the unique way in which self-consciousness apprehends itself without reference to other objects of the same class, or without contrast to a perceptual background or context. This kind of singular reference further results in the experience of the uncanny or the mysterious, discussed below. These three explanations of error theory in the form of regression, immersion, and singular reference result from structures of consciousness to be outlined more fully in the course of this work. Yet awareness of the difficulties isn't just part of an approach to the problem of apprehending consciousness. It's also a prelude to the implications of a discovery of consciousness in our personal and theoretical lives, which has negative as well as positive consequences. In some circles, the development of consciousness and other heightened states has been regarded as a solution to all the various problems of life. But to the contrary, we have begun to see that consciousness is intrinsically problematic, and its development faces increasing difficulties from the growing demands of more acute faculties such as personal identity, freedom, and responsibility. In the everyday, we are faced with the question, what can we do with our lives? More precisely, we must ask not only what shape and form should we give to the phenomenon of consciousness, but also how we can grasp and apprehend it in order to follow the path that it lights up before us. To define ourselves as conscious beings already focuses our inquiry and intimates a method of approach. The methods of empirical science and analytic philosophy have had their successes, but have limitations when dealing with the indistinct, amorphous, and fundamentally obscure phenomenon of consciousness. In this variegated project, an eclectic variety of approaches can be employed, not only phenomenological descriptions and postmodernist narratives, but also metaphor and mythology called upon by Heidegger and others and put to work in the form of religious myth. The fundamentally mysterious character of consciousness is similarly set out below, not so much as an enigma to be resolved, but as a feature that helps us to both understand our subject and to find a way of handling it. So the next section 4 would be the mysteriousness of consciousness demystified.